Philip Guston died in 1980 from a heart attack. He had made his name as an abstract expressionist alongside legends of the New York art scene of the 1950s, Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning and Mark Rothko. And then 10 years before his death, he revealed groundbreaking new work that was the antithesis of the world of abstract expressionism. And he was cast out of their charmed circle and destroyed by the critics. Why has Philip Guston never become quite the household name in the same way as the likes of Andy Warhol or Jackson Pollock? He is one of the most important artists America has ever produced, and I think his work is far more revealing and important. Guston had a difficult childhood. His parents, Rachel and Lieb, were Russian Jews who fled to Montreal in Canada to escape the harshness of life in their home city of Odessa in what is now Ukraine. Guston was born in 1913, and when he was 6 years old, his family moved to Los Angeles. His father found it hard to get work there, and in the end, the only job he could find was as a junk collector, and he was ashamed of what he did for a living, and this shame bred a deep depression in him, a depression that seeped into his son's consciousness. But in his art, Philip would suppress all of these unhappy memories in his early work until the great outpouring of his later pictures that are full of images of detritus and junk, or as he termed it, crapola. His late paintings are full of shoes, empty bottles, disembodied legs. His father's ghost seems to haunt this wasteland that he painted, overflowing with rubbish, the remains of a junk collector's life. His father ended up hanging himself, and Philip Guston found his body when he was just 11 years old, a moment that scarred him for the rest of his life. As he grew up, Guston preferred to be alone, drawing cartoons and reading comic books. Isolation became a way of life for him. He used to hide in the wardrobe of his room, and more importantly, paint in there too. This urge to be alone would characterize his behavior his whole adult life, and during moments of crisis in his painting career, he would treat his studio almost as his isolation chamber, a place that he would go to develop his ideas in total seclusion. The young Guston fell in love with Renaissance art, especially Giotto and Piero della Francesca. But he also loved modern painters like De Chirico, which he says influenced his early work more than anyone else. Look at this painting called Mother and Child he created in 1930 when he was just 17 years old. It's incredibly impressive, especially when you understand that he was basically completely self-taught. He had dropped out of high school and was asked to leave the Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles because they felt he didn't fit in. In 1934, Guston and his friend traveled to Mexico and painted a political statement with the huge mural, The Struggle Against Terror, a monumental work commenting on the evils of the far right. But just as he was finding his feet as a young artist, his family was struck by tragedy again. His older brother Nate was killed in a car accident. This episode made him want to leave his family and leave Los Angeles to reinvent his life. So he moved to New York. Jackson Pollock and Philip Guston were high school friends in LA, and Pollock was already establishing himself in New York, and he urged Guston to move there too to pursue his career. In 1939, he was commissioned to paint the subject Work and Play for the Community Centre of Queensbridge in New York. Government inspectors at the time ordered an investigation into the work as the tail of the dog was juxtaposed with a piece of wood above, which they thought might be a concealed hammer and sickle, and that Philip was a communist sympathizer. They found nothing. Until this time, Philip used the name he had been born with, Philip Goldstein, but his situation had changed. He wanted to marry Musa McKinn, who he had met at the Otis Art Institute in LA, and they had rekindled their relationship in New York. He later said that he dropped his Jewish-sounding name to try and win over her parents, and it stuck. In later years, he expressed great guilt about this, but by then Guston was already established, and it was too late to change it back. Guston painted Martial Memory in 1941, in which a group of kids armed themselves with a trash can lid and an old teapot, and are having a fight in the street. This imagery would remain buried in his consciousness for almost 30 years, until the great outpouring of his later work. He married Musa in 1937, and they left New York City to live in the artist colony of Woodstock in upstate. He depended on Musa and sought her opinion on all his paintings, and in 1942 she became pregnant with their only child. He was concerned that having a child would make it impossible to keep being an artist and would hinder his career. His daughter appears in one of his early masterpieces called If This Be Not I, in the very centre of the painting with a paper crown on her head. In the late 1940s, Guston destroyed much of his work and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown by the time he won the prestigious scholarship, the Prix de Rome, in 1948. He left his young family and flew to Europe to study the old masters who had inspired his early work. At the time, the abstract expressionists were dominating the New York art scene, creating works of huge scale and thinking up new ways to apply paint. Jackson Pollock said, "I am nature," while he dripped his abstract webs of paint onto huge canvases. Mark Rothko applied his painting almost like a series of stains on his massive canvases, calling them spiritual pieces, seen as a higher sort of art where figuration seemed a bit base or out of fashion. Guston returned to New York in 1950, revitalized by his time in Europe, and reinvented himself as an abstract expressionist. Close-hatched brushstrokes that gathered at the center of the canvas. Some critics even called him an abstract impressionist, comparing them to Monet's late water lily paintings. As well as painting with the abstract expressionists of New York, he also drank with them at their legendary hangout, the Cedar Tavern in Greenwich Village, a place to escape the loneliness of the studio. By the late 1950s, Guston's work was in flux. The soft greys and pinks got darker and changed. He was anxious and restless, and his work testifies this. The 60s was the darkest period of Guston's life, and he got increasingly more involved with the political turmoil of the time, especially the catastrophe of the Vietnam War, leaving him with a deep sense of irrelevance in his art. He said, "I was feeling split and schizophrenic. The war and what was happening in America and the brutality of the world. What kind of man am I, sitting at home, reading magazines, going into a frustrated fury about everything, and then going into my studio to adjust a red to a blue?" Abstract expressionism was becoming less important and was getting increasingly pushed out by the new kids on the block, the pop artists. Guston thought pop art was just soulless commercialism, And so in 1965, he left New York again and permanently moved to Woodstock with his family. However, he had no gallery representation, and he had stopped painting the year before, and he was drinking heavily and having affairs, and now things spiraled out of control, and he left his wife and disappeared for a year with a much younger mistress. He returned to Musa in the winter of 1966 and attempted to paint himself out of his crisis, going through a tug-of-war between abstraction and representation. Abstraction lost the tug-of-war, and for the next years he painted furiously in his new style. He now thought that American abstract art was a lie and a cover-up for a poverty of spirit. In 1970, at the Marlborough Gallery in New York, he revealed his new work in an exhibition, an event that has become mythical in modern American art, and people were disgusted. Apparently William de Kooning walked around the gallery shaking his head saying, "This is truly embarrassing," and the critics massacred him. You see, Guston had dared to attack the dogma that it was the sublime destiny of painting to evolve into pure abstraction. In the eyes of some of his fellow artists, he was now in the gutter. However, I think he saved American art. The paintings reflect an absurdist view of humanity, Guston's symbols of evil in everyone. As the years go on, the hooded figures turn into painters or critics, his way of poking fun at the New York art world. He risked everything by breaking the rules of how a modern artist was expected to behave, and got isolated and shunned by the collectors that previously bought his work. But now he felt whole, and most importantly, he was free at last. In the years after, it took a while to find new collectors, but his singular vision for his art won out in the end, and people started looking at his work freshly and were excited by the passion and the drama of his new paintings. He went on to create a whole new pictorial world, and the decade before he died were the most productive of his life. Every part of his world was put together in these extraordinary paintings. With his hysterical black humour, there is a deep disgust at the atrocities of the 20th century. The political rage is made most explicit in this painting, Saint Clemente, which he painted in 1975, where President Nixon is depicted as a horrible cartoon character with a bulbous prick where his nose should be, and a tear falling down one of his hairy balls as cheeks. In real life, President Nixon actually did suffer from a circulation disease that caused his limbs to swell, but in Guston's painting, his enlarged leg stands for the diseased politics of America. In his last years, he said, "There is nothing to do now but paint my life," and that's exactly what he did. Musa often appears in his late paintings. Here she rises like the sun on the horizon with her head haloed like a saint. He never allowed himself to settle into any fixed style and constantly challenged himself, saying, "This isn't just a painting show, I am painting the life I have lived." In 1980, Philip Guston was preparing for a major retrospective at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, with a huge resurgence of interest from a generation of younger American artists that he appealed to on a massive scale. 3 weeks after the opening, he died in his studio of a heart attack. He is buried in Woodstock with his paints and his brushes. He is one of the greatest American artists to have ever lived, and maybe the man that saved American art.
I want to be in the same place that Goya went to, that Manet went to, that Cézanne went to. And I wouldn't mind a pat on the back by them saying, "Not bad, Sonny." That's about all.